Greetings, Champion City Church family. I have a message for you today entitled Exile Songs. I'd like for you to begin with me in a little bit of an imagination exercise. Hopefully, it won't be too big of a stretch. I'd like for you to imagine with me and think of a time when a person might feel completely disoriented, like their life is in a constant state of disruption. Maybe even imagine a season that person might go through that is traumatic and unstable, where pretty much everything that's going on in their life has that sense of uncertainty or instability around it. Maybe even imagine this person or yourself losing a job, a livelihood, or even losing a loved one. Imagine feeling alone and completely alienated, where everything that is familiar has suddenly started to feel quite foreign, where you are not feeling at all like you are in control of what's happening around you, where you are maybe even cut off from everything that is comforting and comfortable. Imagine feeling like you're longing for more for yourself, for your children, but you're just constantly discouraged by all of the corruption, all of the corrupt leaders, the corrupt culture that's around you. And even imagine feeling just completely drained, like a constant state of decision making and adapting is just completely exhausting you. And maybe even like you feel like a stranger, even in something that should feel familiar. I hope you've already picked up on where I'm headed with this. Am I talking about 586 BC when the children of Israel were taken captive and forced into exile by the nation Babylon? Or am I talking about us in the middle of 2022? I hope you heard words that you're like, wow, that could totally be me, and that you felt validated and represented and seen, because it has been a rough couple of years. Many of us, many of you suffered a lot of loss before 2020. You had significant loss and trauma and trials and wilderness experiences before the pandemic began. But a lot of the things that I read off, those feelings, those negative emotions, those overwhelming stressors, are things that we have felt definitely more and more and more pronounced in the last couple of years. This was indeed what the children of Israel were feeling in 586 BC when they were carried off into captivity and forced into exile. This was the human condition, and they were all experiencing a full range of human emotions. And so are we. I think it's important to note that the entire idea of exile really shaped the entire Bible. This idea of being a citizen of one place, but then forced to live in another, this nomadic, not in control, surrounded by corruption kind of lifestyle was something that started in the garden and then went all the way through the story of Abraham, and then all the way through the story of the children of Israel, with each time that they were in exile. And then, of course, we're going to see tons of language in the New Testament about how we are actually aliens and strangers, and we're not citizens of this earth, that we're citizens of heaven, and that it shouldn't surprise us and should even in some ways become a normal state of being to be in exile. And yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I love the book of Psalms, and we're going to spend our time today focusing on Psalm 137, but really I just want to talk about the Psalms in general first. The reason I called this sermon Exile Songs is because I want to remind you that the Psalms are actually the hymnal or the songs of the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, and that the Psalms captured the full range of human emotions that I was just talking about: loss and grief and trauma, feelings of being disoriented and disrupted and discouraged, and maybe even in total despair, and even some just rotten attitudes and bad mindsets. And I love the book of Psalms for this reason. I feel the representation, I feel the validation, I feel the permission to feel this full range of human emotions. And I mean, they weren't just expressing them in poetry and in writing, they were actually expressing them as songs that were meant to be sung. Some of them actually meant to be sung as the Psalms of Ascent as they were on a pilgrimage, traveling on the way to Jerusalem. So not only capturing the full range of human emotions, but singing at the top of their lungs while in community, while on a pilgrimage to go worship in Jerusalem. So I mean, like, really putting your feelings out there and singing them with the other people in your community. I think this honest poetry of the Psalms is really, really important. And it's important when we are also here in 2020 in the middle of some wilderness and desert experiences ourselves, to know that we can look at the Psalms as a full hymnal and a praise and worship songbook, if you will, but that there's a lot of lament and loss in there. In fact, I just want to point out a few little facts. I don't know if you've heard the phrase, there's an app for that. But basically, if you think of any human emotion, there's a psalm for that. And there's a psalm for not just the happy, clappy, praise, God is good, let's worship, let's wave our hands in the air, let's celebrate, let's sing about triumph and victory and the horse and the rider thrown into the sea and the Red Sea crossing and all that good stuff. But that there's also psalms, as I mentioned, of lament. In fact, I think it's right around a third of the psalms are psalms of lament, psalms of grief and loss and even complaint. So there is actually a psalm for expressing really negative emotions, really hard emotions to the Lord. Some of the psalms are what's called communal psalms, and they are meant to express the lived experience and emotions of the entire community. And others are more individual psalms that are expressing the psalm writer, the author's personal experience and personal feelings, and maybe even their personal, venting of their spleen. I think it's also interesting to know that if you were a monk in the Roman Catholic tradition, if you were a monk that fully immersed in the divine hours, which is when you live in the monastery and you follow the full 8 services a day and sing through the entire book of Psalms, you would actually sing all 150 Psalms in 1 week. So if you lived in a monastery and you attended the 8 services a day called the divine hours, you would chant the Psalms. And you have other prayers and other things that you're doing, but the Psalms are really, the hefty part of the liturgy. And the word liturgy means the work of the people. And this is what a monk would do. He would live there and he would sing these Psalms and he would express these prayers to the Lord. And I'm thinking, goodness gracious, like sometimes we pick a psalm out, like, oh, I'm feeling discouraged, or I need some hope, or, I want to read a psalm about when my faith is wavering or whatever. But this dedicated 8 services a day, in 1 week you get through the entire 150 Psalms, is a really intense way to kind of touch base with the fact that there's no emotion left out in this songbook called the Psalms. They're all in there. Even the ones that are a little bit like, oh, like, I can't believe he said that. Like, David, that was really kind of snarky. Like, are you allowed to say that? Are you allowed to say that to God? And I wanted to just point that out, that every human emotion is expressed, that if you were singing them like a good monk, 8 services a day, you would get through all 150 in a week, and you will touch on those individual and communal songs of lament and the songs of praise and the songs of ascent and all of those beautiful categories that they can be divided in. But I want to focus on Psalm 137, as I mentioned, and this Psalm of Lament. I've been thinking about the Psalms of Lament, comparing them a little bit to the idea of singing the blues. I don't know if you listen to much blues music, but the blues are really like, I mean, even if you don't listen to much of it, you know that it's really about singing some sad stuff, like really like singing it out, getting it out there. Kind of reminds me of like the idea of shake it off or dance it out. You know, this concept of, you know, we're going to sing these songs of lament, and we're going to sing about all the horrible things that are happening. We're going to sing the blues. And I remember watching this documentary on jazz music and the blues, and they talked about the very reason that blues artists would write these like super, what people would call super depressing songs, was because there is something about getting those feelings up and out and singing the blues that actually makes you feel better. It's kind of counterintuitive, like a little reverse psychology there. But I think that's what these Psalms of Lament are doing as well. Please keep in mind that these Psalms of Lament, they're not necessarily good theology. They're not there as a prescription for this is what you should do, this is what you should say, this is what you should think when you're going through hard times. This is the attitude that you should have. No, in fact, it's the exact opposite. Sometimes the psalm authors are writing these songs that are just outrageously immature or sarcastic or just complaining and either completely depressed or anxious or like I said, sarcastic, a really bad attitude. So don't assume that just because these Psalms are in the Bible that God is saying, and this is the attitude that you should have. In fact, when the psalmists are singing the blues, I think in many, many ways, they're actually venting some of the most negative and some of the most immature emotions that they're having. And I love that. That gives me permission. And we'll come back to that. But keep in mind, the Psalms are not necessarily good theology. They're not good attitudes. They're not always, oh, this is how you should respond. This is the mindset you should have. And they're not always expressing God's heart. They're not God's ideas, God's opinions, God's perspective on things. They are the songwriter, the poet, the psalmist's perspective on things. And we know that King David wrote a lot of the Psalms, but there's also some other authors, and all of these songs were collected in one book over many years. But none of them had perfect theology, perfect responses, perfect attitudes, perfect perspectives. They just wrote down what they were experiencing, how they were feeling about it. And Psalm 137, I want to give you an example. If you'll just take a moment to look up Psalm 137, Goodness gracious, this is the psalm that they're, that they're singing as they're carried off, or as they're reflecting on the fact that they've been carried off into a foreign land. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars, we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of those songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? I'm just going to stop there for right now. So yes, I have actually chosen what is known as one of the imprecatory psalms, Psalm 137, a psalm of utter brokenness, devastation, trauma, honesty. How in the world are we supposed to sing our songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? And it talks about how they just sat and wept, and how they wanted to, just one translation calls it, we just wanted to hang our harps in the willow trees. Here in this translation, it says, there on the poplars, we hung our harps. And then it talks about their captors, the Babylonian captors, taunting them and mocking them and asking them, hey, sing us one of those songs. One of those songs of joy, specifically. And they were like, we can't do it. And they were so homesick. It goes on to say, if I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. So, that just sounds, sad and homesick and melancholy. And like, how in the world am I supposed to sing like everything's fine? It just reminds me of the times when, in my own life, where I have felt like, how am I supposed to go and lead worship and strap on this guitar or sit behind this piano and act like everything's good? This idea of, can we come into church and be around the family of God and be honest about how devastated we are? Or do we need to sing our happy clappy songs and really only show the shiny side of life and our own experience with one another? And so I definitely could relate to the times when I have been called upon, especially in public, to worship and to sing and to keep going, even when things are really, really hard. And that sometimes it just feels like, even if it's not an actual person taunting and saying, hey, sing one of your songs, thinking about all the other places in the scriptures where it talks about people saying, like, where's your God now? Where's your God now? And even when they were mocking Jesus, saying like, hey, if you're the king, then, get yourself down off that cross. There are times in life when we just feel like the circumstances and the demonic voices and maybe even the actual people around us are saying like, hey, where's your God now? And this psalm, we just sat right by the river and cried our eyes out, thinking about our home, thinking about our story, thinking about the narrative. We're trying to trust that story, but right now we're in a foreign land and our captors are taunting us and demanding us sing a happy song and maybe even dance a happy jig. And the psalmist says, how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? How in the world am I supposed to keep going and worshiping and singing and clapping and praising in the midst of this calamity? And then again, I'd rather have my tongue just clinging to the roof of my mouth rather than forget my home. And then it goes on to talk about, it says, remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. And so, now they're really starting to kind of recount and rehearse and maybe even obsess about this remembering what their enemies did to them, and they're kind of quoting these jeers and taunts. Tear it down, they cried, tear it down to its foundation. And then in verse 8, daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. So now we're going from crying, weeping, feeling the sadness, to words that begin to not only sound like brokenness, but bitterness, full-blown bitterness, and maybe all the way into a full-blown stronghold of revenge and rage. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. I actually struggled with going ahead and reading this entire psalm, you guys. It's called an imprecatory psalm. It's one of those psalms where, gosh, you really struggle with, like, how in the world did that one make the cut? Like, God published that bitterness. You know, it's one thing for the broken, vulnerable, sad ones to make the cut as God published these psalms, and just, it's not like it was just like an editing error, like somehow Psalm 137 like slipped past him, because there's just way too many other imprecatory psalms, way too many psalms where the poet is, the songwriter is being completely honest and vengeful. So it's not an accident, you guys. There's a reason why God published Psalm 137 with all of this, not only vulnerability, but also the bitterness and the rage and the revenge. This whole idea of this dark night of the soul with all of this doubt, and then all of this like toxic emotion coming out and being expressed, and even this really ugly vision of revenge. It's really, really, really hard to imagine being in this place, saying those things to God, singing those things in front of your other, your church family, the other people in your community, and this being okay. We don't often allow people to have really hard emotions, to struggle, to wrestle, to have these really heavy, dark thoughts, and, nonetheless express them out loud, and express them out loud in a church service. When we're in this place where we want to quit, where we want to just throw in the towel, excuse me, we want to do anything but just fake it till we make it, right? And I'm wondering, when the children of Israel said, when the psalmist said, I can't do it. I can't sing the song of joy, a song of the Lord in a foreign land. I had a lot of questions. Like, I got curious. Like, because when we're reading it out loud, we might say it with a particular tone and a particular attitude. But I'm like, was it that they can't? Like, we just can't do it? Was it an expression of vulnerability and weakness? Or was it more like a we won't? Like a protest? Like, no way are we going to sing our song of joy, like on demand, like some kind of a trick pony that our captors are forcing us into. Either way, again, God published this psalm. It made it into the hymnal. So as I wrap up, I just want to contemplate what these exile songs, what these poems that were meant to, again, be sung out loud, and that they're sung out loud regularly. They're not left out in these beautiful liturgical services where they just sing through all 150 as if they're all acceptable, as if all of these feelings and all of these even kind of intense ways of expressing our feelings is acceptable before God. What these honest poems and songs say to us. The first thing I want to bring to your attention is I think that these psalms, like Psalm 137, show us our own hearts and our own attitudes and our own bitterness and brokenness and need for revenge. Like, when you read it, sometimes you're appalled, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. But I think it reveals that we have some of those toxic emotions in our own hearts. So I think reading these Psalms can be revelatory. It can show us some of the unhealthy things that are in our own hearts. But it can also show us the really healthy things that are in our hearts, like really appropriate and beautiful and healthy grief that we need to be allowed to express, to feel and express. But regardless, man, these honest Psalms show us what's in our heart. It's kind of like looking in the mirror. Also, they give us permission. I kind of already hinted around at that. They give us permission. It's like a little prescription for grief. Like, it's like, go ahead, say it. God knows you're feeling it anyway. Get it up, get it out. It shows us, thirdly, that we are not alone. Sometimes when I'm sitting and reading the Psalms, I feel comfortable or comforted because I know I'm not the only person and I'm not the first person who has felt this way. And I feel comforted by knowing that God allowed his children to express those things to him. Also, I've been given a lot of thought to just how therapeutic and healthy and trauma-informed the whole thing is, because I'm reading Psalm 137 and I'm like, yeah, name those feelings, get them up and out, metabolize that trauma out of your body and out of your cell and out of your cells. And I'm just thinking, wow, this kind of ventilation and honesty is a way of like inviting us all into what's really emotionally healthy and not allowing things to get stuck and harbored in there. And I can't stop thinking about how not only were they being this honest about the softer things like sadness, but honest about the really hard toxic emotions like bitterness and desire for revenge. And I'm thinking like, oh my goodness, like not only were they doing that in private, but then they were singing these songs as if this was normal in their prayer services and in their pilgrimages and in their community. So I think lament can free us from toxic and traumatic negative emotions and help us metabolize that stuff up and out of our bodies, souls, minds. And also, I just think it shows us what kind of father we have. I think we have a father who responds to this kind of psalm and all the other psalms of lament and complaint and brokenness, everything on the spectrum from brokenness to bitterness. I think we have a father who can handle it, a father who can take it. And I would love to invite you into another imagination. Start with Psalm 137 and the psalmist, and it almost like after they got done writing it for the first time or saying it or singing it for the first time to God, like just trying to imagine like how God responded. Like, I wonder what God said, you know? Do you think God was like, I can't believe you're talking to me this way? Or as if? Or if God really was like, are you done now? Do you feel better? I don't know. I'm just enjoying thinking about it. I haven't drawn any conclusion, but it's made me curious. Like, how does God respond when we're that honest, that broken, maybe even expressing some really not good theology, not good attitude, not good perspective, not healthy, not mature, but when we're expressing that and we're just being that honest, how does the Father respond? I think the Psalms and the Psalms like 137 especially show us what kind of Father we have. And he is a Father that wants to have such an intimate friendship with us and such a close relationship with his kids that we could really bring everything to him. He listens, he cares, and he can take it. He can handle it. Now, I do want to just wrap up with one additional thought, because I have to hold things in tension, and I have to say, church family, when we don't feel like worshiping, when we're like, how in the world am I supposed to sing these happy, clappy songs? I'd rather just lament. I'd rather just complain. I'd rather just vent. I think that's okay. And I think we need to create more and more space for wrestling and doubting and being honest before the Lord. But I also think it's good to have liturgy and prayers and readings and spiritual disciplines and spiritual habits, these practices that are like these little atomic habits in our life, so that when calamity hits, we have some knee-jerk reactions that just take us into the muscle memory of his goodness, his word, prayer, scripture, things that we've memorized and that we're ready to do just automatically, even when we're disoriented and in grief and completely discombobulated. I love the idea of preparing my mind and my heart with the structure, the infrastructure, the scaffolding, if you will, of spiritual practices, so that when I don't feel like it, when I don't feel like singing, when I don't feel like worshiping, when I don't feel like doing these spiritual activities, that I have some things that are anchoring me, that I have some things like some guardrails around my life. So I'm gonna work on that. Lent is coming up, and I'm gonna work on building even more scaffolding and infrastructure and atomic habits around my life, so that when I am completely knocked off my game and I'm not feeling too into it, that I have some really deep roots that are ever increasing and ever deepening. But I need to grow in this area of lament, of allowing myself to express the really hard things that I'm feeling and thinking, and bringing them out into the light and not hiding them, and not trying to hide them from you, and not trying to hide them from God as if I could, but just actually really believing that I'm so beloved, I'm so accepted, and I'm so acceptable before God, that I can even bring him my bad attitude, not only my brokenness and my vulnerability and my weakness, but all the way into those really icky, ugly, bitter, vengeful things that I think and I'm afraid to say, afraid to admit. I'm like, goodness gracious. Psalm 137 is a perfect example of we can say pretty much anything to God. So as you press into Lent, would you do the same thing? Would you work on building more scaffolding and infrastructure and things in your life, these atomic habits that ground you when you just don't feel spiritual and you don't feel like singing and you'd rather hang your harp in a willow tree? Worship doesn't have to be whipped up with some inflated emotion before you can express how good God is and how worthy he is. But then also balance that with just being able to admit when you just don't feel like you have anything to offer, and you can go into detail about just how rotten you feel. God can take it. I love you guys so much. Praying for you this week that God will be your anchor, and he will be your confidant, and that you will express your full and honest heart to him this week. Love you guys.